All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Canterbury Catholic, and today I wanted to talk about sacred music. Music is something I'm very passionate about, and so when we're talking about sacred music, which really combines the two primary kind of spheres of my life, I guess you could say, Christ and the church and music, it's certainly something that I have some opinions on, have some experience with, and like I said, certainly some passion about. For those of you who don't know, I am a classically trained musician. I'm currently finishing up my degree in music education, and like I said, I've been a classically trained musician for about the past 16 years now. And for the past almost 2 years at my parish, I have been the music director. I've been in charge of programming the music for not just every single mass, but also scheduling rehearsals, doing some extra liturgical events such as like the chanting of the Divine Office, the chanting of rosaries on the first Fridays of every month. Excuse me, and then also for some higher liturgical events like the Christmas Vigil, maybe doing something a little bit different musically and to kind of set it apart from every other mass. And so sacred music is something I'm very passionate in, and these past 2 years really being boots on the ground, not just being in a choir, being singing, but also having to lead it and being part of a parish that is small but growing, and not having all the resources of a large diocesan parish. You learn some things, you pick up some things, and so I'm hoping that kind of through this video, anyone who might be in a similar position, or anyone who might be in any position of leadership in your parish, who, if you go to a parish whose music ministry is struggling or has a bit of an identity crisis and perhaps isn't necessarily fostering the most prayerful environment during the sacred liturgy, maybe you can bring some points up to the music director and try and expand your parish's musical horizons, as it were. So I want to take a second, though, before we start on some more practical things and read what the Second Vatican Council has to say on sacred music. The Second Vatican Council has a document on the sacred liturgy called Sacrosanctum Concilium, and within that you have an entire section on sacred music. And it makes some really, really good points on some allowances, some general norms that should just be givens when it comes to sacred music in a parish. And I want to highlight these 2 points real quick. It's at the very beginning of the document on sacred music, the instruction on music in the liturgy. In the preface, it says, by sacred music is understood that which, being created for the celebration of divine worship, is endowed with a certain holy sincerity of form. So that is more of a definitional sort of thing, just highlighting some definitions and some key terms as the document is about to lay itself out. But I think even that has a certain instruction behind it, right? In other words, that when the document of the Second Vatican, when the council itself is talking about sacred music, it's talking about things that were made explicitly for worship. In other words, don't adapt secular music for Christian worship, or especially certainly not in the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. Hank Hill has this great line, and basically Hank Hill from King of the Hill has this great line in which he says, Christian rock makes neither Christianity nor rock cool. It just makes it both worse. And I think that is very, I will say, unfair to Christian rock. Full disclosure, I'm not a Christian rock fan, but I think there's some wisdom behind that. In other words, keep it out of church, right? And then it gives another point. The following come under the title of sacred music. So now it's outlining specifically what does it mean by sacred music. Gregorian chant, sacred polyphony in its various forms, both ancient and modern, sacred music for the organ and other approved instruments, and sacred popular music, be it liturgical or simply religious. So it highlights kind of two forms, right? Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony. Now, in reality, polyphony doesn't really mean much. Most music technically is polyphonic. For people who don't know, polyphonic just basically means with multiple notes happening simultaneously. Multiple notes or multiple rhythm. In other words, containing harmony. It's not just one line. It's not like a solo or just one melody. There's some harmony to it. And also containing different rhythms happening at the same time. I won't get into the theory behind it, but polyphony is a very blanket term, so for example, let's see, O Magnum Mysterium, right, by Morton Lauridsen, is polyphonic, but what else is polyphonic? I suppose Surfin' USA by the Beach Boys is also polyphonic, right? And so it's kind of a blanket term. But it highlights Gregorian chant primarily. In other words, that it's really saying from the outset that Gregorian chant needs to have some place within the musical culture of your parish. All right, and so that's all I wanted to kind of pull from Vatican II. The section on sacred music is quite short. Most of Vatican II, frankly, is short. It's little snippets. It's very much like the Catechism. But I would recommend you all read it. It's free online on the Vatican website. And it even is cut up into sections, so you can just maybe look at sections that are pertinent to you. But I wanted to talk about those points specifically and to highlight its mention of Gregorian chant because in reality, how many parishes use Gregorian chant? How many parishes have any sort of exposure to it? Before I entered into the ordinariate, I had exactly zero exposure to that in my 18 years at a diocesan parish. And this was a diocesan parish that had multiple choirs who did things well, albeit it was praise and worship, but I would say they did things well as best they could, and were musically literate. These were not musically illiterate or untrained people. It was just not something that was part of the musical lexicon, which is very unfortunate. So if you're a music director, explore Gregorian chant. And if you're thinking like, well, I don't know how that works, why are the notes boxes, why, I'm not a singer, I'm a guitar player and this, that, and the other, it is very easy. I said that I was a music student. I'm not a vocalist. I actually hate the sound of my voice, certainly when I'm singing. I can carry a tune and I can hear intervals, but I'm not a vocalist. I'm an instrumentalist. I'm a brass player. I'm a French horn player. But when there was a need at my parish, I said, all right, I'll take up the reins because I have the most musical training and I'll adapt to, not just the music to what I'm comfortable with, but also adapt myself. So as far as Gregorian chant goes, it's really, really easy. If you can read a melody, you can read Gregorian chant. For one, key is relative, so you're not bound to, certain keys that might be out of your range. So that's very nice. And pacing and rhythm is also relative. You just have to be able to follow the line. And so I would definitely recommend that. And there are tons of resources online. There's a great YouTube channel, I believe the gentleman's name is John Shaw, where he has multiple videos, how to read Gregorian chant. And it's him, he will chant very popular chants such as the Agnus Dei, the Pater Noster, the Tantum Ergo, things that most parishes should just know or be familiar with. And so there's a great website called CC Watershed that also has many resources like that. So I would certainly recommend those. Now, you might also be thinking that, well, okay, that's all well and good, but my parish doesn't really do the Latin thing. My priest doesn't want Latin in light of certain motu proprios that came out. We're just trying to stick to the vernacular, and it seems that most vernacular stuff is just kind of cringy and not great. Oh, and I will also say, with Gregorian chant, it does not have instrumental accompaniment, so you don't have to worry about finding a pianist that can accompany you, or a guitar player, or this, that, and the other. It's just your voice. So, anyways, but back to what I was saying before. Vernacular hymnals just aren't always great, or sometimes they're just too complicated or too heady, and what do I do then? Isn't it just easier to buy some sort of liturgical musical subscription on some Christian rock website and just use that? And to that I would say, well, there's plenty. I feel you, first of all, but there are also a lot more English vernacular hymns and hymnals that are simple and accessible than you might think. My parish, for example, we don't use a Catholic hymnal. We use the 1940 Protestant Episcopal hymnal, the 1940 hymnal, which largely is traditional English and many Latin hymns, just in modern notation and in English. And what's nice about it is in the back it has a liturgical index, liturgical calendar, where I just go over here. It'll have the Mass, so it'll say like third Sunday of Easter, and then it'll say for the processional, hymn 296, for the communion hymn 210, for the recessional 150, and then it'll suggest some hymns from the offertory. And they're all very simple, just short hymns, no longer than, I think the longest hymn in here is probably 4 minutes, and it's very simple, very easy melodies that are good to kind of get into, and polyphonies. And what's also cool is it will have English renderings of Latin chants. So, for example, I just opened up to it. Hymn 191, first tune, is the Pange Lingua, which we all probably have heard of during adoration, sometimes called Tantum Ergo, but it is in modern notation with an optional keyboard accompaniment and in English. And so it has that accessibility, some connection that the choir can have with the people, so people understand what they're singing. And ultimately, this is all to say that music is really important, because not only does it allow connection to what's happening into the liturgy and foster a prayerful environment, but it doesn't have to be the smells and bells, right? You don't have to have people who can read harmony. You don't have to have a world-class organist. My parish, we didn't even have an organ until 3 weeks ago. Before then, we would have a keyboard with a laptop and speakers with an organ patch. And the guy who was playing the keys was a trombone player. And oftentimes, he was just doing the melody and the tenor line or the bass line. And the times that he was doing the 4-part soprano, alto, tenor, bass, it was very, very simple hymns. Sometimes we would only do 2 hymns per mass, and everything else was a cappella. But I tell you, not only did that get the congregation more comfortable with singing in thinner musical settings, but it also allowed us to kind of come together and be like, we are all participating in the music. And it's not about the music, it's not about the smells and bells of the guitar and the piano and the saxophone or whatever. It's about us singing these words, elevating our hearts and minds to what's about to take place on the altar. And even now, our current organist is a flute player who's who's more literate and does a great job at the organ. He's a piano player just as a hobby, and now has taken up organ for us. But he's grown. He's taken lessons. He's done a good job, and we've been able to, along with him, grow our musical comfort. So now we have 2, sometimes 3, sometimes even 4-part harmony, and it sounds great. We've even broken into Anglican chants for that patrimonial heritage. So, don't be afraid to start simple. Don't be afraid to strip things down so that you can build it back up to be even bigger and better than what it was before. The Byzantine church, the Eastern churches, it's all a cappella. I go to my local Byzantine church and it's one guy, and I'm usually the only one harmonizing with him. But I tell you, the people in the congregation, they chant, and it's beautiful. It sounds thick. It sounds like a big pipe organ, even though it's just human voices. Now, sometimes that's not always an option, right? You have ladies who've been singing in the choir or playing flute in the choir for years, and you can't just tell them to get lost. But maybe it's like, well, how about this? Why don't we can have everyone playing their respective instruments for the opening and closing hymns, but for the communion hymns, why don't we come together and do a traditional Gregorian chant, since it's communion? We'll do it in Latin. We'll do it in English first, and then maybe on like high feast days, we'll do it in Latin. And then later on, that can spread to the offertory hymn or the responsorial psalm, and until eventually you have everyone kind of buying in together with this higher musical expression. And my third and final kind of soapbox slash refutation and argument and pushback that I'll get sometimes is, well, okay, that's all good, but we have to take, Vatican II talked about the culture of the people. We have to take that into account. And I would say, yes, the culture of the people is important, but in the context of Catholic worship, ultimately of true Christian worship, you're setting aside cultural pre-existence and in the place of worshiping the one true God, which transcends all cultures, right? Especially within the Roman Church. What about that culture? What about the Roman culture? The Eastern churches do a great job. You're not going to go to a Byzantine church and hear Latin, as you shouldn't. So if you go to a Roman church, why shouldn't you hear Latin? Or why shouldn't you hear hieratic forms of the vernacular, or Western cultural or Western music that is so deeply embedded in the culture of that region? So, just my 2 cents. I would love to hear any experiences you have with music in your parish. And I will close it with this. We have to be open. We have to, I think, in order to further foster this movement of reclaiming the liturgy, reclaiming Vatican II, you have to look at the music. You have to, first and foremost, you have to look at that and you have to reevaluate that. Because I don't know about you guys, but frankly, I would much rather hear something like this right? Small group of people, probably not a lot of formal training, taking it nice and slow, but singing with their hearts and elevating their minds in worship to our Lord. I'd much rather hear something like that in a humble circumstance of worship than something like this. In reality, let's be honest. Tell me what is actually fostering true worship to our Lord. I think we all know the answer. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be praying for you and would appreciate praying for me. Thank you.